Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Talbot. He is assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is the author of The End of Epistemology as We Know It. So, Dr. Talbot, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So tell us first what's behind this book. I mean, what motivated you to write the book, and what's basically the main premise here? I mean, what do you mean exactly by the end of epistemology as we know it?
I should say, it's important. It's important to have catchy titles, but a title doesn't have to be strictly speaking true to be a good title. So,
Yeah.
So the title, so epistemology is like very roughly study of like what we should and shouldn't believe and why we should and shouldn't believe it. Sort of what makes beliefs better or worse, or like more or less rational.
Yeah.
And the title is sort of like kind of a pun, play on words, because in my opinion, to determine like what we should and shouldn't believe, we need to, in some sense, kind of think about what our goals are.
Right.
So what is the end, the thing at which we're aiming in some sense when we believe? And so I think the book is an attempt to call into question a lot of views in contemporary and kind of historical standard epistemology as sort of has been done for a long time. I want to call a lot of that into question, say we need to do things very differently in many ways. So it's the end of epistemology as we know in that sense, but also it's about trying to drive our thinking about what we should and shouldn't believe by thinking about what we're trying to accomplish when we have beliefs. So we're thinking about epistemology by thinking about what are our goals first, and then deriving all the norms, all the rules, in a sense, from that. And I was thinking about what motivated me to write this book. I mean, there's so many things, and it takes so long to write a book, and even before you start writing, there's so much going on. So a lot to say, but when I first started thinking about this stuff years and years and years ago, so my research at the time was on like the epistemology of philosophy. Like, how do we know roughly philosophical stuff? Like, what is it that makes our beliefs about philosophical questions reasonable? And that was a lot of what my work was on. But my teaching was really heavily about philosophy of law, political philosophy, and ethics. So I was thinking a lot about ethics and the law for my students, and I was thinking a lot about philosophical methodology and epistemology for my own research. And I was, in the ethics and the law, there's a lot of thinking about the structure of reasons and the structure of norms and rules and what makes rules or norms better or worse. And people thought a lot about that stuff. And I started applying some of that thinking from law and ethics to work in epistemology that was trying to explain what's so good about having reasonable beliefs. And I just sort of felt like what people were saying about what makes belief reasonable and why is it important to be reasonable, what people were saying about that wasn't really matching up with what they thought reasonableness was, or reasonable belief was, or justified belief or knowledge. And there just seemed to be this mismatch, especially when you start thinking about these things through the lens of law and ethics, where they've been really, I think, more developed thought about what makes norms or rules good norms or rules. And so I started thinking there's just this mismatch, and what people were saying, we need to pursue the truth, and that's what the norms of epistemology is about. But then what they said the norms were wasn't really well suited for the pursuit of the truth. And so there's a sort of a parable in the book that I got from my friend Daniel. It's a really nice, it's like a little story. So you imagine, you run into somebody and you're talking to them and they say, oh, you're talking about their interests, and they say, oh, I really love books. And you say back, oh, you love books? What's your favorite book? and they say, oh, I don't have a favorite book. I love every book exactly the same as every other book. So I love, Windows 95 for Dummies, this outdated book on computer software, exactly as much as the Brothers Karamazov, this great work of literature. And so you think this person doesn't really love books, or they don't love books in the right way, or they don't love the right things about books. And I really felt like that's what you were seeing in epistemology. It was supposed to be about the pursuit of the truth, but the way the norms were structured and what you were allowed to do and what was reasonable to do wasn't always the stuff that was really aimed at pursuing the truth, and especially not aimed at pursuing the important truths. And so I thought there's something going on wrong here, and that's why I started thinking about the material in the book.
And when it comes to these norms, could you give us some examples of those epistemic norms? I mean, when it comes to, I don't know, mainstream philosophy, is there a set of epistemic norms that most philosophers tend to follow or not?
Yeah. So here's probably the least controversial one. Don't contradict yourself. So you don't believe two things that are contradictory.
Okay.
That's a very standard, or you should, if you want to put it as a should, you shouldn't believe contradictory things. It's unreasonable to believe contradictory things. That's, I think, pretty much close to universally accepted. If your evidence really clearly tells you that something is false, you shouldn't believe that. That's a very widely held norm. More generally, people think that you should believe what your evidence tells you is true. It's fairly common, although not universal, for people to think, don't believe things you don't know, stuff like that. But the don't contradict yourself, believe what your evidence tells you, don't believe what your evidence tells you is false kind of stuff. Those are very, very standard, like in fact, pretty close to universally accepted norms in epistemology.
But there's a very important question, I think, to tackle here. So, why is it that we should even care about epistemic norms at all? I mean, why do they matter at all to begin with?
So, not everybody agrees on this question.
Okay.
I think everybody in epistemology, yeah. So part of the structure of the book is to consider a range of different possible answers to that question, and to think about, there's a bunch of answers to that question. I think all are relatively plausible to some extent. So here's an easy answer. The better your beliefs are, the more able you are to act well. Right? If your beliefs are totally disconnected from reality, you're not going to be very successful in doing the things you want to do. That's a pretty common view. So epistemic norms are supposed to be like rules or standards for evaluating, are you thinking well? And then if you conform to those, you're more likely to be able to act well. That's a pretty standard view. But I don't think it's all just about action. And a lot of people, most people, I think, probably don't think it's all about action. There's things we're just curious about that don't have a lot of like practical significance. So it's hard to disentangle curiosity from practical significance. But here's one. I really would like to know if there's intelligent life on other planets. But I'm never going to meet any of those. If there are, I'm probably never going to meet any of them. But not going to have any impact on what I do, I suspect. But I would really like to know. So I'm like, that's the thing I'm genuinely curious about, that I don't think has any practical significance. So often we think to be curious is to want to know the answer to a question, very roughly. So we're interested in the truth about things in a way that's not just practical. Having good beliefs having normative beliefs, having reasonable beliefs is supposed to be the best way of getting to the truth. So that's a way in which it's supposed to matter. We need to socially coordinate ourselves with other people. And to some extent, that requires having coordination in what we believe, who we trust, who we don't trust, about what topics and stuff like that. And so norms, you can think of norms as rules that help us all kind of get on the same page in terms of how to form beliefs and who to trust. So they play that kind of role. So there's a bunch of different explanations for why it matters to have good beliefs or to have reasonable beliefs or to have justified beliefs, in terms of practical success, in terms of, just getting the truth because we care about it, in terms of social coordination, stuff like that. And I think those are all very reasonable answers. And so I don't want to say any one of them is the single correct answer. I think they're probably also all true to some extent. And so we need to think about, given these different explanations for the importance of being reasonable or having good beliefs, what does it mean? What should it mean to be reasonable or have good beliefs?
But I think that there's perhaps a broader question here that might have some bearing on what you explore in the book. So, does the question of whether anything really matters at all also have any bearing here? Because I would imagine that, for example, if you were talking to a radical skeptic or a nihilist or someone along those lines, they would just say, look, who cares if anything is true or not, because that doesn't even mean anything. I mean, something along those lines.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say here, but I'm gonna skip a lot of it. Maybe nothing really matters. That's an open possibility. Part of my approach to philosophy is to try to when you write, to only argue about the things you need to argue about. And so in the book, I'm like, hey, some people think nothing really matters for a variety of different reasons, and I'm not going to try to convince them otherwise. So I think here's the thing to say: even if nothing really matters, in some sense of like objectively nothing really matters, or in some deep fundamental way the universe doesn't care if we live or die, whatever. Even if that's true, which I'm not convinced by, things matter to us. The very limit, things matter to me. I suspect something matters to you, and it does seem like things matter to us, at least to some significant extent. And so even if nothing really matters, things matter to us. And what more could you want? You could want things to really matter. But if nothing can really matter, then there's nothing more to want than what matters to you. And then the question is, I suspect, well, not a question, but I suspect if something matters to you, acting decently matters to you, achieving your goals matters to you. Most people are curious about some things. Even if those things don't really matter, this curiosity matters to them. And so they should, again, if there are norms or rules for belief or standards for evaluating belief that are good to conform to in order to act well, in order to satisfy your curiosity, it matters to us that we know what those norms are, that we figure out what those norms are. So nothing needs to really matter as long as things matter to us. And I think without a doubt, things matter to us.
So, but as long as something matters to us, we also have different sets of norms. So, for example, in the book, you focus on epistemic norms, but we also have moral norms. So, how do you think we should approach things here if there's, for example, a conflict between these two different sets of norms, or even if it's not moral norms, any other kinds of norms that are not epistemic?
Yeah, so this is the notion of mattering is a term I use throughout the book, and I partly chose that because it wasn't a term that another philosopher had already grasped onto and used it for themselves. So I wanted to use it for my own self. And part of what I'm thinking about when I talk about norms mattering is exactly this question of when two norms conflict from different kind of domains, when you're curious about something, but it would make you unhappy to know the answer. So I'm curious about whether or not there's intelligent life on another planet. But if I found out there was not, I would be really bummed out. So and that's true, by the way. I would still really be curious, but I would really be sad to know the answer if the answer is no. Yeah. So there's a conflict there between what I'm curious about, in some sense, what's epistemically good, what epistemic, I want to know the truth, but also what is good for me, what we call prudential sometimes. So there's a conflict in a prudential norm, and we have this question. The prudential norms say don't believe there are no aliens on other planets, no intelligent life. Maybe the epistemic norms say do believe it because that's what my evidence tells me, let's say. So I have this conflict. And then I have this question, well, what should I believe? Now there's a really boring set of answers, which is, well, prudentially, you should believe what prudence says, and epistemically, you should believe what the epistemic norms say, and there's nothing more to say. And this is, but people think there's nothing really matters. That's kind of what they're trying to argue for, is that there's nothing to say other than there's the prudent answer and the epistemic answer, there's no more answers. And I just think, well, there's at least the answer. In this case, what's more important, what matters more to me is it the epistemic stuff or the prudential stuff? And I think we can systematically think about that. And so in normative conflicts, you should follow the norm that matters more in that case. That's the sort of schematic answer. Then the question is, well, what norm matters more in that case? And in order to think about that, we need to think really deeply about why norms matter. And so part of the goal of the book is to say, let's try to figure out why epistemic norms could matter, because that'll help us think about how much they do matter. And because if they don't matter at all, then every time it makes me feel sad to believe the truth, I should always ignore the truth because that would make me sad. And I would think that'd be very surprising. So that doesn't really answer your question, because I haven't told you whether you should ever believe the truth over being sad, that even if it makes you sad. But I do think yes. But I don't actually answer that question in the book. What I want to do is say, let's think about how the epistemic norms could be genuinely really important and what that would have to look like. But I don't try to argue that they are more important than other stuff in some cases. I think they almost definitely are. I think there are pretty clearly cases in which you should believe the truth even though it's upsetting. Even in some cases, you should believe the truth even if it's going to make you act worse. I think that's true sometimes. But I don't try to argue for that in the book. I'm mostly trying to think, what would it have to look like if the epistemic norms ever could matter a lot? But I don't try to argue. I don't try to really work out those conflicts between them and other norms.
So another thing that you do in your book is that you explore the difference between knowledge and true belief, and also then you go through different kinds of beliefs. So to start off with, what is the difference there between knowledge and true belief?
Well, I don't know. I suspect nobody knows. That's a huge, very hotly contested, debated area of philosophy. We don't know. I don't think anybody knows. People have views, but I don't think anybody knows the difference between knowledge and true belief completely. But what we do know is there's these clear cases that are knowledge, and there's clear cases that are true beliefs but not knowledge. So we know these kind of clear difference cases. So the easy example is, let's say, I think I ask you, what's my birthday? And you're like, I don't know. And you just guess totally randomly. And let's say you guess it right. But I don't tell you. You just guess. You form a belief in your head totally randomly about what my birthday is, and you believe it. Even if you got it right, so you'd have a true belief, uncontroversially among philosophers, you don't know my birthday. But then once I tell you what my birthday is, then you do know it. So that's kind of a clear case. Guessing isn't going to give you knowledge, even though it can give you true belief. Forming beliefs in an unreasonable manner isn't supposed to give you knowledge, even though sometimes you luck out and get true beliefs. And then, of course, what unreasonable means is hotly contested as well. So I don't know the difference between knowledge and true belief. And so in the book, I have to talk about knowledge a lot, because knowledge is one of the most standard paradigmatic things that standard epistemology thinks about. And so I have to criticize how they think about knowledge, because I want to criticize standard epistemology. But I don't know what knowledge is, so I have to focus on fairly uncontroversial claims that everybody's going to agree on. about the difference between knowledge and true belief.
And are there any pointless beliefs? And if so, what does it mean to call a belief pointless?
Yeah, almost every possible belief is pointless. That's a real bummer. So a pointless belief is a belief such that it basically doesn't matter if you get it right or not.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example, a fairly standard example. So outside of, there's a park across the street from me, and it's got a lawn. It's got grass on that lawn. I could know, it would be a real pain in the neck, but I could know with a lot of work how many blades of grass are in that lawn.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't matter. That's like not a good thing to know. It's like, even if it was easy to know it, it wouldn't be particularly valuable to know that. So a belief about the number of blades in the grass on the lawn can still be reasonable in a very standard sense. It can fit my evidence. It can satisfy all the standard norms on what is a good belief. It can be knowledge, but it just doesn't matter one way or the other. If I just guessed how many blades of grass on the lawn, so what? Like even whether or not if I guess it totally unreasonably, who cares? And so that's an example of a pointless belief. I have some other work prior to the book where I do some like proofs to show there's a limit to the possible value of pointless beliefs. Effectively, either they have no value or they're effectively infinitely small, infinitely little value. And I think that's really important. So that's like just one example. But it turns out that like when you think hard about pointless beliefs, which it's weird to have a research project where you have to think a lot about what's not worth thinking about, but that's my job. Almost everything you could possibly believe is pointless because so for every interesting question, there's a bunch of really uninteresting related questions. So I think I use this example in the book. I love my wife and I'm really interested in a lot of things about her, but like I could count the hairs on her arm, I guess, and that would give me some knowledge about my wife, but I think that's pointless, right? And so for almost every topic that we're interested in, there's actually most of that topic is really kind of boring. And so it just turns out there is really interesting stuff in the world that we're genuinely curious about and that we should be curious about probably. But most things are not worth knowing and like provably not worth knowing. And I have some interesting proofs in some of my earlier work. And so that's important, I think, partly because it shows us that just being knowledge is not enough to make something particularly valuable. Just being true is not enough to make a belief particularly valuable. Just being a fit to your evidence is not particularly valuable. In fact, almost everything that you could believe that was true and knowledge and fitted to your evidence would be not particularly valuable. Because again, it'd mostly be like little facts about how many atoms in the wall behind me and like, how many miles between me and your mother's best friend, what was the phone number of your grandparents in 1946, stuff like that, right? There's all that facts out there that just aren't particularly worth knowing. And so that opens this question, like, if just being knowledge or just being reasonable in a standard sense of reasonable or just being fitted to your evidence, that doesn't make things good automatically because almost everything that does that isn't good. And so then you're like, does it ever make anything good? Is that really what's important, being knowledge, being reasonable, being true? Or is there something else going on? And that's kind of part of what got me started thinking about this book.
But that's about pointless beliefs. But what are mundane beliefs? Because that's another kind here, I guess.
Yeah, in the book, I talk about 3 categories of belief, and these are just sort of very rough categories to kind of help frame thinking. Obviously, there's a lot of questions that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's more complicated than this, but you have to simplify things a little bit when you're writing. So pointless beliefs basically don't matter at all. There's something I call interesting beliefs, right? Those are ones that like it's good to know those, and then there's this kind of middle category of mundane, which are beliefs that are they're things that are kind of important to, but only because they're useful. And if they weren't useful, they would be pointless. And Whereas the sort of interesting stuff is important, kind of independent of its usefulness. It's more important than it is useful. So, like I know my wife's phone number, I know my mom's phone number, but like, if I was somehow no longer able to use that information, if like aliens came to Earth and said, "Hey, Brian, we're just going to stop you from ever texting or calling your wife ever again," I'd be really upset about that, but it also would make that information useless to me, right? So I want to know my wife's phone number, but if I couldn't use it, I wouldn't want to know it anymore. Or I wouldn't care if I knew it one way or another. So that's an example of mundane belief. It's a belief that's worth having just because it's useful. And then this raises a set of issues, which are sometimes true beliefs are useful, but sometimes false beliefs are about as useful as true beliefs. So, I want to make salad later on, let's say, and I want to put radishes in that salad because I like radishes. And I think I got 37 radishes in my fridge. Well, if I had 36 instead, that's probably still useful. I'm still going to act basically the same. I want to know that I want to know something about those radishes, but it doesn't need to be like strictly speaking true. That's actually not a great example, but it's the simplest one I could think of off the top of my head. There's some really interesting, complicated examples in ethics. Actually, in legal philosophy, this comes up all the time. So in legal philosophy, a very common view of the law is that one function of the law is to give us advice. But in order to give us advice, the law sometimes has to be a little bit more simple than reality is. If the law was it was so complicated that it was perfectly matching to reality in every possible case, it'd be too complicated to understand, you couldn't use it. So a fairly common view of the law is that the law has to be kind of like a slightly dumbed down version of morality. And if that's right, then the law sometimes gives you bad advice. But in the long run, if it does its job, it's supposed to give you, you're supposed to do better on a very standard view. If the law is well made, you'll do better in the long run following the law than you will sort of thinking for yourself in every possible case. That's a controversial view. You don't have to believe that, but it's a pretty common view of what good law looks like. And so in that case, if you believe the law, you would act better in the long run, but your belief would be slightly false, would be a little bit off because the law is oversimplified. So that's a case in which you might do better with an oversimplified belief that you can use, but which is strictly speaking false. You would act better using that false belief than you would if you had a totally true belief, because the true belief would be too complicated to use. And so then we have this question: if what we care about from mundane beliefs is their usefulness, and false beliefs can sometimes be as or more useful than true beliefs, then we wouldn't always really want to have true beliefs in mundane contexts. Sometimes false beliefs would be just as good. And then the epistemic norms, as we standardly understand them, are all about the truth, but then they're not really well matched to mundane, the value of mundane beliefs, because mundane beliefs are about usefulness. Truth and usefulness can come apart. So the epistemic norms, as they're standardly understood, are not tracking what we really are interested in, what we really want out of mundane beliefs.
So I want to ask you about non-standard epistemic norms. We've already talked a little bit about the standard epistemic norms. You gave a few examples earlier. But before we get into that specifically, could you tell us about this idea of epistemic consequentialism? What is that?
Yeah. So in ethics, consequentialism is the view that basically what you should do is determined by what produces the best long-run consequences.
Yeah.
And very roughly, epistemic consequentialism is that idea, but in epistemology. So it's like what you should believe is determined by the consequences of those beliefs. So the epistemic consequences. So like what you should believe is determined by what the rules are, the norms for belief are determined by what norms are best for you to follow in terms of having good beliefs. So if you follow these norms in the long run, you'll have better beliefs than if you don't follow these norms.
And how does that connect then to non-standard epistemic norm?
Well, so the discussion in epistemology, at least historically, uh, has looked consequentialist. So people say, why does it matter that my beliefs are reasonable? Why does it matter that I believe what my evidence tells me? And the answer is supposed to be, if you do that, you're going to have more true beliefs than you would if you didn't do that. So it looks consequentialist. You're justifying, you're explaining the norms in terms of you're going to get true beliefs, you follow norms. But of course, uh, there are going to be cases in which forming one false belief is potentially going to give you more true beliefs in the long run. So use the law example I just gave. Uh, let's assume that the law is well made. Not a good assumption in many countries, but let's assume that we live in a country where the law is well made, and so the average citizen who just believes what the law tells them, who just believes the law is right, is going to act better more often than if they use their own judgment. If that's right, then believing that the law is correct is false, because the law is not entirely correct. If you just believe the law is, you believe the law is entirely correct, that's a false belief. But that having that false belief will give you more true beliefs in the long run about what you should do in particular situations. It'll give you more true beliefs than having the true belief that the law is incorrect. If that's right, again, there's a lot of ifs there, but we can just imagine that's true. If that were true for a person, then forming one false belief about that the law is always correct will give them more true beliefs in the long run than if they'd formed the true belief that the law is not entirely correct. So that would be what I call a trade-off, was often called a trade-off. You form one false belief because having that false belief will give you more true beliefs in the long run. And if you're an epistemic consequentialist, you should say, yeah, that sounds great. But everybody who is an epistemic, almost everybody who's an epistemic consequentialist has tried to deny that this is a consequence of their view. So not every single person in the last couple of years, like for example, Richard Pettigrew said, maybe we could be okay with that. But historically, people who are epistemic consequentialists have tried to deny that trade-offs we should make trade-offs, but it looks like a natural fit that you should say. If forming a false belief gives you more true beliefs in the long run, that's the right thing to do according to consequentialism, but people want to deny this. That's one aspect of it. Really, really quickly, also epistemic consequentialists in contemporary work tend to be like maximizers, which means you should form the best beliefs you can. And I think that is the wrong approach in epistemology. You should be a satisficer or what's called scalar consequentialist. That's a view that comes from Alistair Norcross mostly. And satisficing and scalar consequentialists don't think you should always believe what's best. And if that's right, it causes all these really difficult problems for contemporary consequentialist theories.
And in the book, sort of related to that, you also talk about epistemic trade-offs. What are those and how do they apply to these discussions surrounding non-standard epistemic norms?
Yeah, so trade-offs are cases in which you form one belief that is bad in some way in order to form other, because it's likely to benefit you in terms of producing other good beliefs. So forming a bad belief about what you should, like about some rule for action might give you more good beliefs about how to act in the long run. Or another example from the book, John Doris has this work where he argues that having false beliefs about your behavior and your personal relationships can lead you to act better in the long run. It's also very depressing. And if he's right, then it may be that those false beliefs about the relationship can also lead to other true beliefs about how to act well in your relationship.
By the way, could you give us an example of that?
No, that's John's work. So that's
okay,
I don't know that work. I don't know that
fair
works
enough.
well enough. I'll give you an example I do know a little bit better. There is some research that suggests that overconfident academics publish better. So, and there's some reason to think that thinking you're a better researcher than you in fact are, that you're more capable than you in fact are, leads to more discoveries. So that'd be a way in which forming a belief that's false, thinking you're a better researcher than you really are. This is not only false, it probably goes against your evidence. Unreasonable belief. That's one bad belief you can form. But if you form that bad belief, you're somewhat more likely to learn things in the future. And if that's true, you've traded off, you've sacrificed your belief about your abilities. You've had this one's bad for the benefit of these other long-term benefits in terms of learning other new things, other interesting things. Sorry, one second, my cat's trying to come in and out of my room.
It's probably basically the idea that if I think I'm not good enough to become, I don't know, an academic, for example, it's even pointless for me to study or to apply to it, right?
Yeah. So this is, of course, that's an empirical question, like what actually works. So I'm a philosopher, not a scientist. So I can't tell you if it's really true that being overconfident will help you. But if it is true, then that would be an epistemic trade-off. If being overconfident helped you learn new things, that would be a trade-off where you're sacrificing one belief and making that bad in order to get other good things. And yeah, I think it's plausible, although again, I don't think it's been studied well enough that we can be 100% certain, but it's an interesting example to think about.
So tell us now about the methodology that you use in the book when it comes to trying to come up with what you call replacement norms in epistemology.
Yeah, so methodology is basically start with what people have said, their explanations they've given for why the epistemic norms are supposed to matter.
Yeah.
So, for example, the consequentialist explanation, which is the epistemic norms are supposed to matter because if we conform to them, we form more good beliefs.
Yeah.
Or there's a social view that says the epistemic norms are supposed to matter because if we all sort of follow the same rules, we can better figure out who to listen to and who not listen to. Or the action view, which is that if we have good beliefs, that's going to be good for action in various ways. So each chapter of the book, or many of the chapters, start with, this is what philosophers have said about why the epistemic norms are supposed to matter. Let's just assume they're right. And then ask, what would norms that do what these people are talking about look like? So what would norms that produce better action look like? What would norms that enable good social coordination look like? And we don't, so typically that's assumed that these stories are going to vindicate the norms that we typically accept in philosophy, but I don't assume that. So we say, let's just take the answer very seriously, the idea very seriously. Let's not assume anything about what the norms actually do look like, and just say, if you started from this idea and you just went, what would you get?
And what do you think would be some of the biggest objections to the kind of way you approach things here, basically to your methodology?
Yeah. So I've gotten different objections from different people.
Okay.
One objection is the epistemic norms aren't supposed to matter, so who cares? That always makes me a little bit sad. If they don't matter, why are we thinking about them so much? So another objection is, even if I'm right in a sense, the non-standard norms that I'm interested in, we can't follow them. So for example, we can't like intentionally form false beliefs even if that's going to give us true beliefs in the long run. That's a pretty standard view. Like, even if you knew that being overconfident was going to give you more, help you out in the long run, you can't just make yourself overconfident on that basis. Some people think that's impossible. And so there are people who are like, well, so what? If we can't follow these norms, they're not the right norms. That's probably the most common objection. Yeah, and then a sort of, I guess one other objection is just people have cared about knowledge and justified belief in the sort of standard sense for all of history, all of philosophical history. So there's no way I can be right. I can't. So I'm saying that they've always been mistaken. So I must be wrong because I'm disagreeing with Plato and everybody else. So that's I think a very reasonable objection.
And I mean, how would you reply to those objections? I mean, do you think that at least those people would have a point or not?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think it's a very reasonable worry. If you disagree with everybody, it's good evidence that you're wrong. But I think the approach that I'm taking to these questions is an approach that I don't think people have taken enough previously. And so, so there's all this work outside of epistemology on why norms matter, right? So again, I do a lot of work in ethics and legal philosophy. And, you know, in legal philosophy, people have thought about, they always think about there are the laws and then there are the justification for the laws. And if the justification for the laws doesn't actually mean the laws are good, then we should change the law, right? And so, and same thing in ethics, we've thought a lot about like why people have thought a lot about why it's good to be ethical in various ways. And so what I've really tried to do in the book is take these ideas that are these discussions from outside of epistemology about the nature of social norms or the nature of respect or the nature of consequentialism, all this stuff, and bring them into epistemology in a way that I don't think has been done as much previously as it should have. And so it does give you surprising results. But I don't think that is a devastating problem because if I'm disagreeing with everybody, but they haven't been approaching things in this way that I'm thinking about things. And by the way, I should say I'm not disagreeing with literally everybody, not literally everybody. I'm not the only person to have questioned sort of standard epistemology. Quite a few people have done that. So like, I don't want to say I'm like I'm not even a pioneer. I'm like following in the footsteps of a lot of really important philosophers. So I don't want to puff myself up too much, but I'm disagreeing with a lot of people. And so I think it's not surprising because I'm trying to bring a method to this discussion that has not been used often enough. And so it's not surprising that people have gotten different results because they haven't as much used the method I'm using. Again, other people have. I'm not the only person to have done it this way, but most people don't approach things this way. And then there's this other question like, well, if we can't do this, then why does it matter? And it's true. I don't think you can't just like most of the time you can't just decide to believe something. But you can do things to try to cultivate a character that means you'll have better beliefs. Even if you can't choose in any particular situation what to believe, you can like there's reasons to think you can cultivate being the kind of person that will believe the kinds of things you should believe. And then so it still can be interesting to think, have we cultivated in ourselves the right kind of character to believe the right things? And then of course we want to know, what are the right things to believe?
And so what kinds of replacement norms do you suggest?
It's going to depend on why the epistemic norms are supposed to matter. So again, the norms that would be the right norms if all we care about is acting well are going to be different from the norms that if we partly care about satisfying our curiosity. Because acting well is more disconnected from the truth more often than curiosity, whereas curiosity is often about the pursuit of truth. Yeah. So it's really going to depend on what the right answer to the question is, why do the epistemic norms matter in the first place? And since I think there's a lot of different good answers to that question, I can't sort of univocally say what should replace it, but I have some general thoughts. Every view about why the norms matter is going to tell us that sometimes we should make trade-offs. Sometimes you should form one bad belief in order to benefit in other epistemically relevant ways. When you should form trade-offs is going to vary depending on what the epistemic good is supposed to be. But all the views I consider end up saying you should make trade-offs sometimes, which are hugely controversial. So that's part of the interest of the book. So the replacement norms, the ones that are going to be the right norms, are going to say make trade-offs sometimes. And then the other thing is the standard epistemic norms say never contradict yourself, never believe anything that's like clearly against your evidence, stuff like that. Never believe anything that's clearly false. And the replacement norms aren't going to agree with that. So they'll say you should contradict yourself if that's helpful in the long run. You should believe false things if that's helpful in the long run. But also sometimes believing false things is good enough. We don't have to have perfect beliefs. We can have beliefs that are good enough. And I think that's going to be true basically on every view. Although what counts as good enough and when a false belief can be good enough is going to depend on what view. So it's not like an abdication of the truth. The truth is really important in a lot of contexts. But getting completely to the truth is not always as important in every context. You can get close to the truth of all the, so here's the truth and here's like all the false things you could believe. Sometimes being like right here, really close to the truth, but still wrong is good enough. And, it's going to depend from situation to situation. But I think all the replacement norms are going to say sometimes getting close enough to the truth is good enough. And then in pointless cases, being far from the truth is probably fine in a lot of cases. So all the replacement norms are going to say make trade-offs sometimes. And I think they're all going to say, you don't need to get all the way to the truth in every possible situation. And that's a fairly radical view in philosophy.
I mean, it's fairly radical, but isn't it more realistic to assume that most of the beliefs we have are just at best good enough? I mean, even when it comes to most of the knowledge that is out there to be acquired, I mean, first of all, I guess we don't even have enough time to process all that information and then to form correct beliefs or true beliefs. But then, I mean, even as we move along, as time passes, we as humanity keep acquiring more and more knowledge that we don't yet have there to learn about.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's definitely right. And this is actually a thing I'm in my upcoming work I'm really interested in. So one thing people could say in response to what you're saying, so I'm very sympathetic with this view. People could say, well, it's true that like as a whole, we don't really have, like we can always improve as a whole, but they might say individual beliefs are either true or false, and individual beliefs can be knowledge or not. And so, even if we keep making progress like at the holistic level, they would say, you shouldn't believe something if it's not true yet. Like if you don't know the truth, don't believe it. About individual things. And they say, well, you can know individual things and you get the truth about individual things, even if we keep progressing as a whole. But I actually think this kind of emphasis on individual bits of knowledge and truth is often a mistake. And we should be kind of emphasizing our kind of collective our kind of big picture holistic set of beliefs. What I in the book called the picture of the world around us. I think that might be really what's more important, and that is what you're saying is 100% applies to that. As we acquire new information, our picture gets better and better and better, but like it's definitely as a whole picture never going to be completely accurate. And so we have to think, if we kind of evaluate our kind of picture of the world as a whole, we can't hold it up to this ideal standard because we're never going to get there. And we have to say, what does it mean for the picture of the world as a holistic thing to be good enough? And I actually think that's the right way of thinking. I suspect that's the right way of thinking about epistemic values, kind of more holistically than atomistically, rather not about individual beliefs, but about kind of collective sets of beliefs.
Mm-hmm. So one final question then. Are epistemic norms categorical? And what does it mean for them to be categorical? What does that word mean here?
Well, here's what I think it means, and then you can tell me if that's what you think it means. When philosophers talk about norms being categorical, they typically want to say something like it applies to everybody at all times, regardless of their desires and interests. Is that kind of what you have in mind?
Yeah, that's usually what I think about when someone mentions that word. Yeah.
So, are epistemic norms categorical? It depends. So it again depends on the function of epistemic norms. So I think moral norms are categorical. And if you think that the moral norms kind of involve, have implications for what we should believe, then then at least some epistemic norms will be categorical because they'll be derivative of the moral norms. But if you think the epistemic norms also have to do with satisfying our curiosity, then you might think, well, whether or not they're categorical then depends on if there are sort of categorical requirements on what we should be curious about. So if you think there are certain things that everybody ought to be curious about, and that then there are going to be categorical requirements on what you should think about and how you should think about it in order to satisfy that curiosity. But I'm not convinced of that. I think that's an open question. And if curiosity is more subjective and like just you get to be curious about whatever you're curious about, then there wouldn't be any categorical norms that are connected to curiosity. So it depends a lot on sort of what the end of epistemology really is. If it's about morality, if it's about action, if it's about curiosity, if it's about something else, the categorical nature of it is just going to kind of come along with that.
And so that would be what, in your mind, it would determine whether they should or shouldn't be categorical. Is that it?
Yeah, you figure out why they're supposed to matter first, and then you can answer the question of whether or not they're categorical.
Great. So the book is again The End of Epistemology as We Know It. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Talbot, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, drbriantalbot.com/philosophy. Yeah, doctor. And if you Google Brian Talbot philosophy, you're going to find me pretty quickly. So
great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been fun to talk with you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigor N, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Ben-Sliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.